Loaded language. Existing words are loaded with new meaning. New words are added, other words are banned or dropped from usage. This affects the ability to think as well as the ability to communicate comfortably with those outside the group.
Yeah, I did go through most of this. Really early on, we talked about how language sort of
is central to this whole project.
Yeah, it is.
There's so many new different ideas, words being used in new ways. The central fight it feels around this whole thing, expressed in things like the title of a documentary being "What is a Woman?" or a question asked at a Supreme Court hearing, "Can you define a woman?" deals with the fact that some of the concept and ideas are being redefined according to this ideology. But then that new definition now needs to be imposed on society as a whole in that totalist frame that we were discussing earlier. You mentioned before how language seems to be the battleground that a lot of these fights are wrought on.
Especially in language, and the language that people use in, and this isn't really even just trans activism, it is really the trans community in general, is the language changed so much over the decade that I was within it. For example, when I first thought that I might be trans, I called myself genderqueer, which people don't really say genderqueer anymore. Now they say non-binary, which is almost the same thing. Or for example, I would have called myself transgendered with an ed on the end, and now people are, if you use that, they'll be like, oh, it's not a verb, you can't call yourself that, it's transgender with no ed, it's an adjective. And so there's that, and then there's other language assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth. And at one point in time, they were saying designated male at birth and designated female at birth that assigned. And at one point, it was coercively assigned female at birth. They just really switched up all of the different acronyms and different just lingo that people were using. For example, I'm trying to think of other examples, but at one point in time, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, they wanted people to refer to trans feminine people, so those people who are male and are transitioning, they wanted people to refer to them as trans misogyny affected. So they wanted people to refer to them specifically by their oppression, which I thought was really bizarre. And I found it was almost like, it felt a little bit like a personal attack. It shouldn't have, because I didn't identify as a woman, but it did feel like they were trying to say that people who transition that were born female don't experience misogyny. We're the ones who experience the true misogyny, sort of thing. And that's why I personally found it really offensive. And this was probably the very first time that I ever heard language in the community that I was like, okay, now you're going too far, sort of thing. And I do think that a lot of it is language oriented. Just so like, there's just a whole lot of, you can't say that in the community. It's even as I'm talking, I'm almost at the same time, I'm not correcting myself, but I know if, for example, I don't know if a couple minutes ago I said people who are born male, you can't say that in the trans community. You can't say they were born male. If they're a trans woman, you can't say they're born male. They were born female. They were female the whole time. So that sort of thing where I have almost like the person, not a person, but just like an inner critic that's just like correcting me, even though I'm out of the community now. But I know what sort of things people would get mad at me for saying. But I've tried to turn that off entirely.
Based on all of the different things that we've talked about already, how are you going to score loaded language?
Severe.
Yeah.
Yep.
How does it affect the ability to think and communicate? Like in the religious realm, we've had the thing where if you define things like salvation or exaltation, Mormons have their own special definition of it. So we may communicate with an evangelical Christian and say words that they understand according to their definition. And we know we're saying things and they'll agree with us, even though if they were to drill us on it, our definition is something very different. But that at least lets us get in the door and have those conversations. Does that kind of secret private definition thing take place?
Yes. Maybe not like a secret, but if you think about, for example, people doing like a survey about how they feel about different trans issues. How do they feel about trans women in sports, for example? And if you ask the question, do you think that trans women should be able to compete in women's sports? That's a completely different question than, do you think that biological males should be able to compete in women's sports? So that's one of the ways in that it makes it more difficult to communicate with the greater public, is that now we're finding now a trans woman. I don't say trans women usually. Sometimes I do if I'm referring to how someone identifies themselves, but I'll usually just say men because they're adult human males. So that's what I would say. But so the way that all of these questions get framed, where we're changing the definition of what a woman is or what a man is, by saying, should trans women be allowed to be in women's sports? You see the word woman and go, oh, that's a woman should be in women's sports. That makes sense. And it's obscuring the reality is what it is. So it's obscuring the reality that it's a biological male who has male advantages in women's sports. Yeah, no, it does. It prevents that communication with others. There's a conflict there for sure.
No, that's a brilliant example of how this would play out. All right, so you said severe, so we'll go ahead and rank it as severe. Thought terminating cliches. Short phrases, pat answers, metaphors, and emotional reactions are pre-established to frame doubts. Doubt and questions are automatically shut down.
Yeah, and like the biggest thought terminating cliche is trans women are women, of course. Trans men are men. Because if that's true, then anything else that you could criticize about it, for example, just as I brought up women's sports, if trans women are women, then women belong in women's sports, then that's the end of the thoughts. There's no more thinking to be done there.
And you can know if this plays a big role if there are a bunch of short pat phrases that you're accustomed to, if someone raises this doubt, I just say these few words, answer solved. There's no more further cause for question or debate. And over the course of this conversation, you've mentioned several. So I knew we were getting to this at that point. But if you were to rank it, what do you give it?
That's probably also severe.
Okay. The benefit of thought terminating cliches is that it really does shut down dialogue and debate. You don't have to learn what the best arguments are on the issue because you already have that ready-made answer that prevents you from having to dig any deeper.
And like the other ones are, trans people are valid, things like that, where you just don't have to look any further than that. You just go, they're valid. That's it.
Yep.